Well, we got a bombshell ruling from the Supreme Court. Cannabis users can now possess firearms in the United States. And I need to break this all down with an expert. So here we go. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is The Breakdown. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Be sure to follow me at Resident Legal Diva on Substack, YouTube, and all socials, where I do deeper dives into these issues. So super excited to have on Sam Kamin, who is a professor at law at the Sturm College of Law, which is at the University of Denver in Colorado. I believe you are the first professor of cannabis law in the country, if I'm not mistaken, or am I putting...
I was for sure. Yeah, there's some other folks have caught up and started doing this as well, but I was definitely the first person on this beat for a while.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing some of your expertise, because I thought this was massive and I've been watching and waiting for this ruling literally all year. So first off, can you give me your initial reactions? As soon as you saw the ruling, what was the first thought that popped into your head, and why is this so important?
Well, it was decided 9-0. All the members of the court, and this court, doesn't decide too many things, 9-0. So they all saw that the current federal statute gave the government too much authority to criminalize the possession of weapons by people who illegally use scheduled drugs. And the court was unanimous on that point. It splintered a little more with Justice Thomas writing separately, Justice Jackson writing separately, joined by Justice Sotomayor. But there seemed to be very broad consensus that, at least as it was currently written and read by the government, this federal law simply gave the government too much power.
Yeah, so this is, for folks who may not remember, this was the statute that Hunter Biden was convicted under. So this is something that has, a lot of implications for folks. So what does this mean for cannabis users, both recreational and medical, and in terms of, because this is like literally a bombshell. This is something that has been, debated heavily of, hey, listen, my doctor, I'm a vet, my doctor, prescribed cannabis for my PTSD, but I still want to keep my weapons. What do you mean I can't? Should I lie on the form? Should I not? So what does this mean for folks generally?
Yeah, I think you really put your finger on it with that last comment. Prior to this ruling, people who wanted to access marijuana, rather, whether they were adult users or medical users, had to make a tough choice. They could either lie on the federal form and say that they weren't marijuana users, or they could tell the truth and be denied the federal permit to purchase a gun. And neither of those were particularly attractive options. And people have been prosecuted for filling out the form incorrectly, and for, as Mr. Hemani, for being a illegal drug user in possession of a gun. So sort of a damned if you do and damned if you don't. This ruling says that at the very least, you can't be denied a gun simply for being a person who uses drugs. That is too broad a category to justify an infringement on an individual's Second Amendment rights. The court is quite careful to say that's all we're saying today. We're not saying that everyone who uses these drugs is entitled to a gun. We're not saying that the government couldn't prove that it would be dangerous for a particular person to have a gun. It just found the overlap between person who uses scheduled drugs illegally and person who can be denied a gun, that the overlap between those was simply insufficient to justify the current law.
So then what do you think is the next step in terms of deciding who should or should not have possession of a weapon, even though they're a user of these substances? So in other words, we've heard about, at least in the legal field, the habitual drunkard, right? So you got to prove that this person is constantly intoxicated. Therefore, they're going to handle the weapon in a way that is inappropriate, that will harm people, that sort of thing. We've seen the red flag laws around, someone who may be struggling with mental health issues and taking away their guns until they are stable or some other determinations made. What do you think that's going to look like in terms of cannabis?
Yeah, I think the court was careful to leave that question for another day. I think that the court was pretty suspicious about this idea that certain people could be categorically excluded. So I think they will look at that quite hard. You're exactly right that the court was pretty skeptical of the government's reference to founding era laws that imposed penalties or other infringements on liberty for these drunkards, right? Public general drunkards, I think, is the phrase that was used there. And the court said, well, these were people who consumed so much alcohol that they basically were incapacitated by it, that they could be either required to post a surety or could be placed into detention, either for their own protection or the protection of the public. The court says that's just not a person who, as the example the court used, either uses marijuana occasionally, or there's lots of other scheduled drugs that can be misused. They mentioned taking your wife's Ambien when you can't sleep. That is an illegal use of a scheduled drug. Under the government's theory, that would have allowed either that person to be denied a gun or to be punished for up to 15 years in prison for having one. The court said that wouldn't have been countenanced in the founding period and shouldn't be countenanced today.
Right. So now turning to marginalized populations, because of course that's always something in every legal scenario. I'm looking at broad impact, not of just mainstream whoever, but also other populations folks may not be thinking about right away. Do you see any impact on Black and brown populations in terms of this ruling? Do you anticipate maybe seeing increased gun ownership possibly as a result, or, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think so. I think, yes, the people now will have a federal right to a gun who under federal law were prohibited from having one. That will go away, and that will certainly increase the number of people who will have that kind of access. But I think, sort of stepping back a little bit, this is another step in a number of steps around the changing law of marijuana. That, since the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, it has been a prohibited substance under federal law, regardless of what's happening under state law. And I think a lot of people sort of get that wrong, that even as the vast majority of states now permit marijuana either for adult users or for medical patients, until quite recently, all of that was illegal under federal law. You had saw under the Obama administration some memos, one of which was referenced in the opinion the other day, that said, we don't think this is a good use of federal resources. We've seen Congress passing spending riders that prohibit the Justice Department from going after people who are medical users of marijuana. So there have been these sort of chips away at the wall of federal prohibition. Probably the biggest step in that direction was the announcement by the acting attorney general back in April that he was immediately rescheduling medical marijuana as a Schedule 3 rather than a Schedule 1 drug. So that's not legalization. It's not even a rescheduling for all of marijuana. Rather, his order rather peculiarly treats the same drug differently, whether it's being used pursuant to a doctor's recommendation or simply by someone who is of age who wishes to use it for recreational purposes.
So yeah, definitely this is going to expand access, which is great, because again, I look at this from a constitutional perspective, right? It shouldn't be, cool for me and not for thee, right? The Constitution makes it clear that everyone should have the same access. So that's always something that I'm looking at. But we saw the president had, written an executive order around cannabis. We saw now, like you mentioned, that acting AG Blanche has, there's been a rescheduling of cannabis. We now saw that TSA said, oh, well, you can kind of bring it with you on the plane, but we still have our discretion. We still reserve the right to boot you off your flight, right? But there is some discussion saying that TSA may allow folks with a cannabis card and allow them to possess it as they're traveling. So with all of those things, Does this mean we're getting closer to legalization?
It's hard to know. I mean, I quite a while stopped trying to predict what this particular president is going to do. I think that he's clearly getting some pressure from one of his core constituencies, which I would say is sort of young white men, the Joe Rogan branch of the Republican Party, which is not a phrase I thought I'd ever use. That to make good on some promises that he made to increase the availability of marijuana and I would say other drugs, including certain psychedelics. And this was, sort of in direct response to pressure he was getting from Joe Rogan to move more quickly on marijuana. The means taken by the acting attorney general don't necessarily get us there. That is, Mr. Blanche said, well, I have to do this under our treaty obligations, and those treaty obligations say that we're supposed to put it where it best belongs, and we think that medical marijuana best belongs in Schedule 3. It's really hard to get from that to everyone being able to use marijuana as an unscheduled drug. That is just simply legalizing marijuana, putting it in the same category as alcohol and tobacco, things that are federally regulated but outside of the Controlled Substances Act. The means that Mr. Blanche used to get there to get where we are now, sort of don't get us the rest of the way to full legalization. So I think I and a bunch of people who write in this field are watching these hearings that are supposed to begin, I guess, a week from today, about what comes next pretty carefully.
If you were in charge, you as an expert who has been studying this from inception till now, you've seen models that have worked internationally, right, in other countries. So if you had your druthers, what would be the next steps? How would we get there?
So I think the next step would be something that makes marijuana more available, but that is more carefully regulated than a lot of other substances. So, I'm writing currently about how the U.S. doesn't have a particularly good history of regulating addictive or habit-forming substances that are being sold through a commercial market, right? So whether we think of that as alcohol, whether we think of that as tobacco, big pharma, big sugar, big agri, there are lots of different industries where federal legalization and regulation have not led to particularly good public health outcomes. And what I am concerned about is that if we are moving in that direction, that we get some policy in place and some regulations in place that help us avoid the worst kinds of outcomes, right? An example that I'm currently working on is the parallel to sports gambling. That sports gambling was prohibited more or less at the federal level for a long time. It was, after a Supreme Court decision at the end of the last decade, legalized in the states, and we've seen what happened, right? We've seen this sort of explosion of commercialized and targeted sports betting, and the harms that does, both to the integrity of games, but much more importantly, to the sort of core group of young male gamblers who, many of whom are really having their lives significantly diminished as a result of their addiction to those services. And I'll just sort of say, this is not unrelated to what we see, the litigation that we see about social media, that there are concerns that these products are being created that are intentionally addictive, that are intended to keep people on task longer at the expense of public health. And I think that however federal laws are liberalized, and I am no fan of the federal prohibition of marijuana, however those laws are liberalized, it should only be done in a context that keeps public health and welfare in mind.
Yeah, which means experts need to sit at the table. So hopefully that will happen.
Yeah.
But last thing. So basically, the only path to true federal legalization is through Congress, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately is the right answer. The and that will bring us into conflict with some of our treaty obligations. Now, I don't think the current administration cares too deeply about those. I think that they were really using those as a fig leaf for the rescheduling of medical marijuana. But that is a negotiation that's going to have to happen. A lot of those treaties were begun at the instigation of the United States, that we made other countries sign on help us fight the war on drugs. So for us to flaunt them now, I think would create some real concern. So there will need to be some international agreement on this. There will need to be some consensus developed on this. Am I optimistic that the current administration is going to help build that that broad buy-in? No, I am not. But that is one of the sort of, I think, prerequisites to putting some sensible policy in place here.
Actually, that's very interesting because I didn't think about the international aspect in terms of, hey, burn your cannabis and help us, right. You know what I mean? Fight trafficking. And oh, wait, never mind. We're actually going to legalize. We're good. Like, leaves a lot.
Yeah, there's plenty of room here for hypocrisy in our relationship to these treaties. So that is a thing which, if done right, really will need to be worked on here.
Just a reminder, midterms are coming. So if this is an issue that's important to you, make sure to vote with your feet and go handle your business when November comes. So with that, Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate you sharing your insight. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. And make sure to like, follow, and also check out Sam's work. Where can they find you on socials if they want to read more about your deep thoughts on cannabis?
That is a great question. I'm Professor Sam Kamin at Blue Sky. It's sort of the only social media platform I'm using these days, but come find me there, and I engage with these and much less serious topics there.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. And pleasure. To everyone, stay safe, stay informed, and keep demanding justice. Take care.